Hello and welcome to the Dyslexia Mom Boss podcast, the show that helps you not only feel empowered and knowledgeable, but confident and a boss mom in the dyslexia journey. I'm your host, Dr. Lauren. Hello and welcome back to the Dyslexia Mom Boss podcast. As you all know, I'm your host, Dr. Lauren. So this is season 3, as I've been letting everyone know, and this is really focused on service providers. And so those of you who are avid listeners know and understand that my whole mission is to bring awareness and resources to 195 countries in the world. And I know this podcast reaches many different countries. So I really want this to be a place where you can get all of your information and then obviously reach out to service providers who are on the show to really get more information. So with that being said, I want to introduce my guest today, which is another neuropsychologist based out of Los Angeles. And her name is Dr. Karen Wilson. Thank you, Karen, for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Lauren.
Absolutely. And so Dr. Karen Wilson and I, we've known each other via social media for about 2 years. I think we did a live on my Instagram account about 2 years ago. And then you had me on your podcast for Child Nexus. So I'm just really excited to now have you on my podcast.
I'm excited to be here. I'm excited about all these great collaborations and getting great information into hands of more parents.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So let's kind of just delve into who you are. And really my first question is, and I know this is going to be a part of your story, but what inspired you to become a neuropsychologist? And can you really tell our audience, what you do and what are the ins and outs of what it looks like being a neuropsychologist?
I can definitely do that. And I actually was interested in life sciences to begin with. Neuropsychology was not even on my radar. I was planning to go to medical school and had taken biology and biochemistry and was on that route and took psychology as an elective and just fell in love with it.
Interesting.
But I needed to find a way to marry the two, my interest in biology and, behavioral neuroscience, behavioral endocrinology, and psychology. And then I took a class in Introduction to Neuropsychology as an undergraduate. And then I just realized that that's where I fit. That was a great way to combine my two loves of biology, the brain, and also human behavior. And I never looked back from that point forward.
That's awesome. I love that. And I don't know if the audience knows this, but my undergrad, I was a psychology major. I don't know if I told you that, Karen. And I loved human behavior. I was just really fascinated by why people do what they do. And, I loved being a psychology major, but I just didn't know if pursuing a PhD in psychology was my journey. Obviously not, but I know I use my psychology degree in so many ways in interacting with students and parents and people. So that's awesome. I love how you have married your two loves. So tell us a little bit about what a neuropsychologist does. And my next question, we'll get into that, really kind of compares neuropsychologists to psychologists, but tell us, what do you do in your daily practice?
So in my daily practice, so I'm a pediatric neuropsychology. I can also see adults, but the bulk of my work is working with children and adolescents. And in my day-to-day work as a pediatric neuropsychologist, what I'm doing is really understanding how problems in the brain relate to problems seen at school, home, or with peers. So I am interviewing parents, I'm doing assessments on kids, I'm speaking with their teachers, and I'm getting a roadmap to their experience at home and at school. And digging deep into understanding the root of their struggles and then developing a plan to address those issues.
Right. So I don't know if there really is a difference, but I know from my experience, and I'll preface this by saying, working in public school and also private school, when I was in public school, I found a school psychologist, at least in my state, wouldn't diagnose dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia specifically in the psych report. And obviously whatever was in there would translate to the IEP. But I have felt in my private school settings, really partnering with outside sources and private neuropsychologists, they would really diagnose and put that on reports. So my question for you to kind of share with our audience, is there really a major difference between a neuropsychologist and a psychologist in regards to those specific diagnoses? Or is that just like, I don't know, the clinician's individual opinion as to what they're comfortable with diagnosing, if that makes
Yeah,
sense?
I think when we're talking about diagnosing, we're talking about the same thing. We're putting a different label on the same thing. So, for example, when we're talking about
Okay.
dyslexia, it is often referred to by psychologists because we use a diagnostic and statistical manual, and it refers to it as a
Right.
specific learning disorder in reading. But we know that neurologists have coined the term dyslexia, and we know that we're talking about the same thing. Obviously, it can look and present very
Okay.
differently because you can have struggles with phonological processing, you can have difficulties with fluency, reading comprehension. And so there are a lot of places where things can break down, but we're really talking about the same thing, but calling it something different. And I, for one, will use both terms. I will say, according to
Okay.
DSM-4, this is a disorder of written expression, but your child has dyslexia, and this is what dyslexia is. And when we talk about kind of a neuropsychologist and a clinical psychologist, a pediatric neuropsychologist is a licensed psychologist. The difference is that we have specialized training in how the brain develops. And in our clinical
Right.
practices that we use this training to evaluate and help manage children with brain-based disorders. So we do more than just learning-based disorders. We talk about brain injury and medical diseases, but also developmental problems. And dyslexia is a developmental disorder.
I actually love that answer. And I was really thinking, when you shared that, I was really thinking about the advice I would give when I was a learning specialist. I would give parents the advice of always seeking a neuropsychologist, nothing against clinical psychologists. I just personally felt, and maybe this was just the person I worked very closely with. I knew her reports. She understood, as you said, the brain development piece. And I think that that's the missing component to when parents are like, there's something wrong. I know there's something wrong. And then, teachers or whatever are saying, oh, they'll just grow out of it or whatever it is. But I think when you have that brain based understanding and that development, you can really call it what it is. And I love how you said you kind of use those terms interchangeably, what's in the DSM versus actually saying dyslexia or SLD or reading disability or whatever it is that I've seen on these psychological evaluations. But, it's interesting because I do find that, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems as if most neuropsychologists are private. And I feel as if that is an equity issue because when we are diagnosing kids at school using our tax dollars, to have the psychologist and the OT and the SLP diagnose, sometimes it doesn't really give us the deeper picture of what's going on. And then I find the parents who can invest the thousands of dollars to actually pay a private person, they come back with a more detailed report. And obviously the school has to start from ground zero. So
Right.
I'm curious to know your thoughts on that. Why isn't there access to neuropsychologists, let's say in urban schools or communities?
Yeah, I think the issue is definitely exacerbated in urban schools, but it's a school-based issue in general. Because if you look at, like you mentioned, a pediatric neuropsychology report, and again, a report done by a school psychologist are going to look different because we're looking at different things. When a student goes for a school evaluation, their whole focus is deciding if a child has a problem with academic skills or skills that impact their ability to access their curriculum. Do they qualify for special education services? And, right, that's the whole goal. But a pediatric neuropsychologist is going to find out if there are academic skills that are interfering with learning. But we are focusing on understanding the why a child is having problems in school or home. And we can do that by examining academic skills. But we also have to look at other thinking skills needed to perform well in and outside of school. So we're going to look at things like memory, attention, problem solving, executive functioning, language development, and we're going to also pay attention to psychological issues. We know that there's a significant increase. Actually, since before COVID, there was an increase in depression and anxiety and stress.
Right.
The pandemic exacerbated those issues, but those issues can also interfere with learning. So if you go in just looking to see if there's a problem with reading or math or spelling, and you miss anxiety or you miss depression or you miss ADHD, then you're still not going to address the underlying issue that's impacting kids. And to your question about equity issues in private practice, I think there are neuropsychologists who work in medical centers, right? And I think it's just hard to find those people. I worked in both. I've worked in medical centers. I worked in medical centers while I was doing private practice work. And it's just hard to find those centers and those assessment places because they're not easy to find on websites. You have to really dig deep and know that they exist to know that, a UCLA or a Cedars-Sinai here in Los Angeles or Harbor UCLA has assessment centers, but it's not something that a parent would know unless someone told you, unless your pediatrician is aware of that service. It's just hard to find. And I find that that's one of the biggest issues is that neuropsychologists exist outside of private practice, but it's hard to find them.
Interesting. So you actually just touched on a lot of things that I kind of want to unpack.
I did.
The first thing, you really did. It was great. It was awesome. But the first thing I really want to touch on is what advice can you give parents then? Because the first line of action with parents that I coach or I'm tutoring their child and really giving them some advice is they go to the school first. And obviously, well, I don't want to say obviously, but sometimes the school ignores them in various ways. Oh, it's fine. Oh, let's check back next quarter, or your child's on grade level, whatever it is. But how can they find someone like you? I mean, what would be something they would Google, or who would they talk to? I mean, it's very unnerving actually to think as a parent, I know there's something wrong with my child and I'm sitting at the keyboard and I'm like, what do I Google?
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I've had parents say, it took me 3 years to find you. And 3 years is a lot of time when your child is struggling with reading, writing, or math. And, that's one of the reasons why I started Child Nexus was to make information. I think there's a barrier to information. There's an access issue for services, but there's also an access issue to information. Parents will get feedback, like you're saying, that your child is fine. They'll grow out of it. Right. But then they don't know what to do when they get that feedback. They don't know the law in terms of putting in writing that you want an IEP, that you want your child assessed, that there has to just be, suspicion of difficulty to start an IEP process. And they also don't know if they don't agree with an IEP assessment. And I'm not an educational attorney, but I talk to a lot of educational attorneys that you can request an IEE, an independent educational evaluation.
Yes.
And that is often the way that a lot of people who don't have funding for a neuropsychological evaluation can get a neuropsychological assessment because I do IEEs. Parents don't have to pay out of pocket to see a neuropsychologist or a clinical psychologist who does more comprehensive psychoeducational evaluations. If they get an IE for the school and they have a neuropsychologist do that evaluation, do that IEE evaluation. And so that's something that many parents will say, I never even knew that was an option. So that's one of the things they need to find out. And that's, like I said, an access to information issue. Rarely do you see a school, actually have never seen a school that says, if your child is struggling, here is the process. Request an IEP in writing. If you don't agree with the IEP, then it is your right to request an IEE. Schools don't publish that, right? It's in the law, but it's not published.
And I think it's, I absolutely agree with that.
Yes. And then they also need to talk to their pediatricians. Children are seeing pediatricians or family doctors. Parents need to be able to advocate. I feel like they don't feel like they have enough knowledge to advocate for their children and to ask for what it is that they need. And so oftentimes they don't know what they need. A pediatrician can make a referral for a neuropsychological evaluation. And, you may not get the referral because you have to show that there's a need for it. But, you can request it. You can talk to your pediatrician and request it. And so there are a lot of ways to kind of access an evaluation. There are a lot of medical centers that train clinicians And, I'm thinking of UCLA, they have a psychology clinic where students are training to become neuropsychologists and clinical psychologists. And you can often get a reduced fee for evaluations through universities that have medical centers or who are training clinicians to do these types of evaluations. And they're supervised by neuropsychologists and clinical psychologists who are going to read the report over and make sure that it has everything in it that the parent needs to get their children the services that they need and the treatment that is essential for their ability to reach their full potential and to thrive. But it takes a lot of time to find all of these resources and to do the research. And part of what I want to do is to make that process easier.
Right. And actually, that's a really good resource for parents to know, because when I was working on my master's in special ed, Syracuse University had a clinic very similar to what you're talking about, where the local folks would come and we were supervised. I remember it was very clinical. We had a two-way mirror. And I remember it was like the class of people were sitting behind the mirror and we had to take notes while each of us went in to give the Woodcock Johnson.
Right.
And it was really, really nerve-wracking. And then we had to write a report. And then our professor, had to make sure the report had everything. And she was very, very, very strict. And I remember, obviously I was in grad school and I was like, gosh, why is she so mean? Why? No, now I realize why, because these reports are serious business. And you have
They're
to,
serious business.
The parents are depending on that 30-page or 25-page report to give to the district or give to whomever so we can, move the needle to say my child needs these services. So no, I think that was really valuable. And I want to touch on another thing that you had talked about. I can't seem to really kick the whole idea of it took me 3 years to find you. So I really want to touch on that SEL component. Now, I've spent in the 12 years I've been in education, half of it was in middle school. And that was just by fluke, because I always thought I'd be in elementary school for more than the 4 years that I spent. But middle school years are tough. And, that's the time where kids are really wanting that autonomy. They want to be able to prove to their parents they don't need their help. Hormones are kicking in. All of a sudden, developmental issues are more prevalent in terms of, mental health obviously is still prevalent in the younger ages, but something about puberty, it really just ramps up. And so I'm actually thinking of a student that I worked with last year before I left the schools. And I remember working very closely with the neuropsychologist who diagnosed this student. And there were some sticky situations in regards to, well, the chicken or the egg. What is the root cause of this child's disability? But we have to actually work on this disability first before we can actually address that deeper meaning. The reason I bring that up is because parents don't know what they don't know. And your child might have been super happy and full of energy. And then something happened once they transitioned from 6th to 7th grade or 7th to 8th grade. And then you're like, well, they won't get out of bed. And, they don't want to go to school and their stomach hurts all the time. And, they're lazy and they're not doing work. Well, maybe there's depression that we have to really touch on first before we can really hit on that dyslexia. So as a clinician, how do you sift through diagnosing that and really making that, and I think this is the art form in the report, how do you make that clear in a report where someone like myself can say, oh, okay, I think this is what's going on, but we have to tend to this first. And how do you explain that to the parents?
Yeah, and I think it has to be laid out just the way you described it. And I think that's the beauty of doing a more comprehensive evaluation, particularly when you don't know. And you may suspect dyslexia, but it could be something else. And dyslexia co-occurs with other things. It can co-occur with ADHD. It can co-occur with, dysgraphia, and it can co-occur with anxiety. And so you really have to have a good understanding of a child's history. So it's not just the testing. The testing will give you some information, but it won't give you the context. And so you need that early history. You need to know, when did language develop? You need to know, were there attention issues when a child was younger? Is there a family history of anxiety and depression? What was school separation like when they were younger? All of this information paints a picture of what was evident first, what came later, what is the primary issue, because you can have primary issues and then you can have secondary issues. And so you want to be able to identify what is the primary issue, what is secondary. And you want to understand a child's strengths. And I say this because it's so often we're looking for what is the problem. And with dyslexia, we know there's an unexpected difficulty in reading. We know that it's brain-based. The research clearly shows that there are differences in brain connectivity between dyslexic and typical reading kids. There's a neurobiological basis for reading struggles. But individuals who have dyslexia can be paradoxically great critical thinkers and have strong reasoning abilities and great memory abilities. And when those are very strong, they can compensate for their reading difficulties for a long period of time until they hit middle school, like you mentioned. Then they struggle because the reading demands have increased, the executive functioning demands have increased, and things start to fall apart. And then you might see depression, but not because depression is the primary issue. It's because they've always had a learning issue. It just was never identified. It was never addressed. They were using all of their cognitive resources to compensate. And they can no longer do that when those demands have exceeded their ability to do so.
Right. That was beautifully well said and put. And I think, I mean, we're both moms. You know, we see our kids in ways where sometimes we may not put on our clinical hat first. You know, like we might say, well, I don't know about you. Maybe you do, Karen. I feel like as parents, we don't always do that. And then we have to stop and think, you know, we have to stop and say, okay, well, I know my child has struggled with this, and these are some things that we need to really unpack, or these are things we really need to stop and think, how can we chunk this information? So I think that that was an excellent answer.
It's hard as a mom. It's hard as a parent to see your child struggling. And I think every parent's first reaction is not my child, right? It's like, my child is fine. It must be the school, you know, it must be, you know, that they're not getting what it is that they need. But then when you have to, you know, see that there is a struggle and say, regardless of what is causing it, we've got to fix it. We've got to address it. We've got to see what is the best way to support my child. And oftentimes parents don't know what to look for. You know, you see a child who's can't tell time on an analog clock, right? Has trouble kind of recognizing quantities without counting with their fingers. And you think, maybe that's just the way that they do things, or they're more visual. And we don't recognize that as a math disability. And so I think one of the biggest things that parents can do is to educate themselves if their child is struggling.
That's what I say.
Yes, it's so important. If you get an IEP report that says your child has a specific learning disorder, I can't tell you how many parents say, I don't know what qualified my child for services. I just know that they struggled with reading or they struggled with math. And then you dig into the IEP and find that last page where there's a little line that has a check mark beside it that says specific learning disorder in reading. But parents don't know what that is. What is that? There's no description of what that is, only how it impacts their child at school. And so the best thing a parent can do for themselves is to educate yourself on dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, whatever it might be, ADHD. And, you know, it might be other health impairment, and it has attention problems. Well, what does that mean? Is this ADHD? Ask the question. If you don't know, go to your pediatrician, who can get a referral to a psychologist or a psychiatrist to make the formal diagnosis. And then if a child is getting support at school, oftentimes that's not enough. It's not enough for them just to get accommodations and modifications and support at school. Parents need to know, how do I support my child at home? Because that can move the needle significantly and can accelerate the progress of a child. If parents understand what it is their child is struggling with and know what they can do at home to support their child's learning and their emotional well-being.
Right. You really touched on that SLD. I think that that is so critical, because what parents don't realize is that just one of the 13 categories to qualify for special education. But within that category, I think there's dyspraxia, there's dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, there's aphasia. I think there's so many things. Yes. And I just think that that goes for teachers. I mean, I used to joke around with one of my co-teachers. You know, they would say, well, what is specific learning disability? And I said, like, where's the specificity? There's no specificity on the IEP. Right. And it would be one of those things where I would say, oh, it's probably dyslexia or dysgraphia. And then when I was co-teaching 8th grade math, I was like, no, I think this child has dyscalculia. Like they
Right.
are struggling with those patterns. And we know by the time you hit 8th grade math, you need to know your multiplication facts.
Right.
You need to understand your addition. That's really where that anxiety and depression comes in, because math really is its own language within itself. But no, I agree with you. And I actually have a few episodes. I think episode 6 is educating the educator. So parents really feeling knowledgeable to know that they can educate their child's teacher. Hey, here's what's going on with my kid. Let's kind of brainstorm some accommodations, or this report says X, Y, and Z. Can you provide these accommodations? Can we work together? And then I also have another episode, I think episode 9, which is 5 questions to ask to start the D-cubed conversation, because these are questions that parents, and some of them to you and I as professionals, we're like, yeah, of course you would ask that. But parents just don't know.
Yes.
And it's really important to ask those questions, to be like, well, why can't this be on the IEP? There's no real legal reason why it can't be. It just depends on the district or the state or whatever's happening with the school. So I know that that can be another episode within itself, but I'm just really glad that you touched on that, because again, that's why this podcast exists. So Karen, I do want to ask you one final question before we talk about Child Nexus.
Yes.
And I think this is really important for our Brown and Black communities. So those who do not know, Dr. Karen Wilson is a Black neuropsychologist. And I just want to know, what advice can you give to the Brown and Black communities in regards to navigating this journey? Because we know it is different for the Brown and Black communities, especially in regards to knowledge and resources. So what advice can you give them?
I would say that you have to become your child's advocate. You have to become your child's advocate. And becoming an advocate means equipping yourself with all of the information and all the tools needed to advocate for your child, to make sure that they get the support that they need in order to succeed. We know from the research that Black and Brown kids, children with learning disabilities, are expelled at higher rates for behavioral problems beginning in preschool. The rates are very high. So instead of looking for why a child is not sitting in their seat, is kind of yelling out impulsively, is maybe having some refusal issues because maybe they don't understand the information that's being presented, and that's their way of coping with their difficulty and discomfort, they're expelled or they are kicked out of preschools. And we have to do a better job of understanding why kids are struggling, because when you are kicked out of learning environments, you're depriving children of the opportunity to learn. And we need to fix that issue. And that really comes from identifying, again, the source of the struggle. Why is the child acting this way? And we know, and I've said it in a number of conversations, is that even in early elementary school, if kids are struggling to read and you're in an environment, a learning environment where kids laugh at you or you're teased, they would rather be in the principal's office than sit in the classroom and read out loud. So they're going to do whatever it takes to escape. And if that means yelling out, being rude to the teacher, knocking things off the desk so they don't have to read out loud in front of their peers and be embarrassed, they will do that. But if we stop at the behavioral issue and say, this is a behavioral problem, we don't know why he's acting that way, and we don't dig a little deeper, we will not help that child and get that child the resources they need in order to be successful. So really, as a Black parent, and I'm a Black parent and Black neuropsychologist, it's having an understanding of why your child is struggling, going to your pediatrician, going to any talks that people are giving for free about learning struggles, listening to podcasts like this one, getting all the information you need to equip yourself to go in and advocate for your child and to ensure that they get the support that they need in order to thrive. And then develop you getting the tools as a parent to know what it is that you can do to help your child at home.
Right. That makes perfect sense. And I'm glad you really brought up that statistic, because that is true. And I think that more than often, if we don't have the resources and knowledge, we tend to react emotionally. So if our child is being called to the office a lot or is being suspended or whatever that situation is, it's best to equip ourselves and also to really say, because I would always say this to teachers and parents too, but more so teachers when I worked with students that were quoted the troubled children, and they were always the brown and black kids. And it's like, behavior is communication.
Right.
So instead of being frustrated that this kid is interrupting your, I don't know, your Shakespeare lesson
Right.
or whatever the case is, why don't you actually stop and look and say, this happens the same time every day. It doesn't really matter what we're reading. Maybe it's something I'm doing, whatever it is. We have to look at that behavior as communication to get to that root cause. And so any parents who are listening to this, really consider that, because kids, they need us. They need the redirection. They need the support. They need the unconditional love. So they're communicating they need something, but it's just coming out in a very distasteful way.
Right.
That could turn into expulsion, or that could turn into suspension. But really, that's going to eat away at their self-esteem, which, as we know, that can turn to the pipeline to prison.
Absolutely. So, and they're not getting the intervention that they need. Julie Washington, who I just adore, who's a speech and language pathologist who does a lot of work in this area, says kids can't respond to the intervention if they don't get the intervention. So if they have dyslexia, and we know that there are effective interventions for dyslexia, if they're identified as having a behavioral problem, they will never get the intervention for dyslexia, which is the intervention that they need.
Exactly. They'll be labeled as emotionally disabled,
right?
or anxiety or whatever, which, not saying that that's not real, but that's not the root intervention, the root cause. So definitely. So Karen, can you tell us a little bit about Child Nexus, how people can find you, and tell us a little bit about that. It's very exciting stuff.
It began as a passion project, and it was really born out of talking to hundreds of parents. Like, over my career, I've sat in rooms with hundreds of parents who've had a child who struggled, and were able to, through an assessment process, find out why they're struggling and how to support them. And again, I talked to you about their barriers to access to information and reliable information. There's a lot of information online, but not all of it is rooted in science. And there's a lot of opinion out there. And so I wanted to have a place where parents could go to get information that they can trust, but then also connect with professionals who can help their kids thrive. And our system is so fragmented, where if you need a speech therapist, you need to go over here. If you need a child psychologist, you need to go to this site. Oh, if your child has dyslexia, then you need to go to a different site. And I just felt like there needed to be one place to go if your child is neurodiverse, is struggling with learning, is struggling with mental health challenges. Can there be one place where you can go to get information that can help you better understand your child, understand what they could be struggling with, and how to support them? And so that is really where Child Nexus was born. And it came out of talking to other specialists in the field, educators, speech language pathologists, child psychologists, child psychiatrists, occupational therapists, coming together to say, we have different perspectives and help kids in different ways, but we're addressing the same child. And so we are here. We can provide information to parents. And if you want to connect with us, to work with us directly to help you and to help your child, then we can do that. And so that's really what Child Nexus is. It's a resource for parents, and it's also a place where parents can go to get additional support. We just launched learning groups for parents who have a child with ADHD, dyslexia, or a specific learning disorder in reading, or anxiety. And as a parent, you want to understand, what is that? How does anxiety show up at home, at school? Because 80% of kids who have problematic anxiety don't get treatment. And so it starts with parents understanding what that is, and then how to support them at home, how to support them when they have play dates, how to advocate for them with the school in order for them to get the accommodations that they need. And so that's what we're doing, bringing in experts. Parents get an hour with a neuropsychologist, an hour with an educational attorney who can walk them through the IEP process and how to, work with the school or to request an IEE. So they're going to get an hour of that time. They get an hour with a psychiatrist who can talk them through, why is medication prescribed, when is it appropriate, when is it not appropriate. And it's 8 weeks of walking through this program with us. And so that kind of speaks to some of the things we've talked about. The parents need that information. They need to be equipped with the information so that they can advocate for their children at school and support them at home. And that's what we want to do.
Absolutely. So what's the membership fee for parents to join? You
Yeah,
said this is free?
Yeah, there's no membership fee
Wow.
to get access to the information. But if they want the 8-week learning groups, we're now running it $597 for the 8 weeks. And as you know, the fees for educational attorneys and neuropsychologists for an hour of their time, it's like $200 to $400 an hour. So it's like you get 8 weeks, 8 hours, face-to-face time with these folks for $500, right? $597.
That's amazing. Wow. Where do we find this? We just go to childnexus.com?
Yeah, go to childnexus.com and you can click on, I think there's a pop-up for the learning groups. We're keeping the groups small because we want parents to be able to ask their questions. We want to be intimate. We want to be intimate. It's only 15 parents in each of the groups, and we're only doing 3 groups at a time. And so, again, we want to make sure that parents are heard, that they have their questions answered, and they have the tools needed to support their kids at home and advocate for them with the school.
This is amazing. So those of you who are tuning in, be sure, hopefully you're listening and you've already gone to your web browser as you're listening and you're typing in childnexus.com, because I want you to definitely check that out. Well, Karen, thank you so much for being here, sharing your wealth of knowledge. I'm just so happy to reconnect and really have this rich conversation with you. And I think it was very impactful for so many people out there who were tuning in. And please share this episode with anyone that you all feel could really use this information. So thank you so much, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for all the work that you do to educate parents and educators about these brain-based issues that impact more than just learning.
Absolutely. Thank you.